Hello everybody, and welcome to today's VATSIM 101 video where we're going to be talking about CTAF and position reports. Now this video is for the CTAF trial that is going on in the United States as of March 2024. So before you go any further in this video, make sure you're abiding by the code of conduct in the country that you're going to be flying in on VATSIM. So a lot of you have been asking me what CTAF is and when are we expected to use it. So CTAF is an acronym, stands for Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. It's a dedicated frequency at each airport that works similarly to the Unicom frequency that we've been using for the last number of years. It's either used at non-towered airports, also known as uncontrolled airports, or when the tower at that specific airport is closed. Just like Unicom, we're going to report our position and intentions as we get closer to the airport. CTAF can be found in a couple of different ways. One, you can look on the airport chart for that specific airport, or you can look at the VATSIM AIP and it will tell you what the CTAF frequency for that particular airport is. Or another very easy way, if you go over to your pilot client, you type in .CTAF and then the identifier for the airport that you want it for, it will populate it right in the text chat of the client for you. The CTAF frequency at every airport is going to be different, and the reason for that is so that it avoids any congestion on the radio for airports that are very close to each other. One of the first places you'll want to look is on the airport charts. So right here at Chicago Executive Airport, we can see that the tower frequency is 119.9, which also acts as the CTAF frequency for the airport. Now, in the real world, Chicago Executive Airport does not have a 24-hour tower. So if you don't have any air traffic control coverage at Chicago Executive Airport, you're going to make your position reports on the tower frequency 119.9. Now here we have Midway Airport, which is not very far from Chicago Executive. And as you can see, we have a tower frequency of 135.2, but there's no dedicated CTAF frequency. In this instance, VATSIM tells us that we are going to use the tower control frequency as our CTAF frequency. So when there is no air traffic control coverage at Midway, we're going to go to 135.2 and start making our position reports there. Now at Chicago O'Hare Airport, which is not very far from Midway at all, or Chicago Executive, in fact, it's actually in between both of those airports, we can see here there are 6 different tower controller frequencies that we could be communicating on, and it all depends on what runway we're going to be using. Now, VATSIM has already thought of this, and they have dedicated one of these frequencies to be our CTAF frequency. So, 2 different ways that we can go about finding out what frequency it is. One is we type in .CTAF and the airport identifier into our pilot client, and then it will tell us what the CTAF frequency is. Or we can head on over to the VATSIM AIP, which we can find right on the VATSIM website. So over here on the left-hand side, we see VATSIM AIP. We click on that, it brings us to this page. And right here on the right-hand side, it asks us to put in the airport code that we want the CTAF frequency for. So we put the identifier in for Chicago O'Hare, we hit search, and now it tells us that the CTAF frequency at Chicago O'Hare Airport is 120.75. So that is where we are going to be making those position reports. So again, the 3 different ways we can find our CTAF frequency is either on the airport charts by hitting .CTAF, the airport identifier, in our pilot client, or we can come over to the VATSIM AIP and it will highlight in green what our CTAF frequency is. Now, in terms of using CTAF, the FAR AIM tells us that we want to start making our position reports when we're within 10 miles of the airport. On VATSIM, they have a little bit different of a policy as to when they want us to start broadcasting our intentions on the CTAF frequency. So when you're operating at a Class Bravo airport, they want you to start making those position reports when you're 20 nautical miles away and below 10,000 feet. This is because Class Bravo airspace is very, very complex airspace, and there's a lot of planes that can be operating into those airports at any given time. So just as a safety margin, they say, start your position reports when you're 20 nautical miles from the field and below 10,000 feet. Every other airport that's out there, it's going to be exactly like the FAR AIM tells us, when we're within 10 nautical miles and below 5,000 feet. Now, the altitude is a very good guideline because that's typically where you're going to be when you're at about those distances anyway. But if you're flying into, let's say, a Class Charlie or a Class Delta airport and you're 10 nautical miles away, maybe you're at 8,000 or 9,000 feet, go ahead and start making those position reports. Even though you're a little bit higher than what the VATSIM policy is, when you're within that range, it's a good idea to just start making those position reports anyway. So let's talk about the airport traffic pattern for a second. When you're flying IFR, this to an extent doesn't apply to what you're doing. This is mainly for VFR planes, but it's a good idea, even if you're flying IFR, to try and abide by this traffic pattern as best you can to make yourself a little bit more predictable to people that are operating around the airport. So the standard traffic pattern is going to have you making left-handed turns as depicted in this chart right here. So when you first take off, you're going to be flying the upwind leg. The first turn you're going to make is your crosswind leg. The next turn after that is going to be your downwind leg, and that's when you're flying in the opposite direction of the departing runway. The next turn you're going to make is your base turn. And then the last leg you're going to fly is your final leg, and that's when you're going to be lined up with the runway to come in and land. Now, a standard traffic pattern is going to be making left-hand turns as you see here. If you're supposed to be making right-hand turns in your traffic pattern, the airport documentation is specifically going to say it. So if you're operating at an airport and you don't see anything about what kind of turns you're supposed to be making, you're going to be making left-hand turns. Now, once you enter the airport traffic pattern, you're going to want to make your position reports to reflect what part of this traffic pattern you're in. Now, the normal way that you would enter the airport's traffic pattern is on a 45-degree intercept from the downwind leg as seen here. From there, you continue flying your downwind leg, then you make your base turn, then you make your final turn to come in and land. Depending on the type of plane that you're flying is going to determine when you're going to make that base turn. So if you're flying something like a single engine prop, you might do it when you're 2 or 3 miles out from the end of the runway. If you're flying something a little bit bigger, like an airliner, you might want to make that closer to 5, maybe 10 miles out because you're going to be flying a lot faster. Your turns are going to be a lot wider. In some cases, though, you may not be able to enter the traffic pattern from that 45-degree intercept. You might have to do it from the base leg or from the final leg, depending on if you flew a star or what air traffic control has instructed you to do. So if air traffic control dumps you off, you're 15 miles out from the end of the runway and they tell you to make in a straight-in approach, or if the star that you're flying on has you transition onto the approach from 15, 20 miles out, you can go ahead and proceed with that straight-in approach. You don't need to come back around and enter the traffic pattern from the 45-degree angle, but you want to make sure when you're updating your positions that you're telling everybody that you're making a straight-in approach. That way, anybody in this traffic pattern can adjust accordingly to make sure that they don't get in the way. For example, I flew in an uncontrolled airport in the real world where there were a lot of IFR operations going in and out of there, and I would very commonly have somebody that was coming into the airport 10 miles out on a straight-in approach. So most of the time what I would do is I would extend my downwind leg out a little bit further so that way I could come in behind them. That way I don't get in their way and force them to go around or risk a mid-air collision. So just adjust yourself accordingly depending on the needs of the traffic operating in the area. Now, when we're departing the airport traffic pattern, when we take off, the FAR aim again states that there is a certain sort of way that they want us to do it. Again, mainly for VFR planes, doesn't necessarily apply to IFR, but the standard way you'll depart the traffic pattern when you take off is either on a 45-degree intercept outbound in the direction that you're going to make those turns, or you can simply make a straight out departure. But let's say we're flying a SID and it tells us once we get to 500 feet, we're going to make a right-hand turn to intercept the course to our first fix. That is what we're going to want to do. So you're going to want to follow whatever the procedures of your flight call for. But if you're deviating from this traffic pattern in any way, you do want to make sure that you're telling everybody that so they can adjust accordingly once again. I know a lot of people may not understand how a traffic pattern works or what it is, because a lot of you probably haven't done any VFR flying on the network, but it is a good idea to keep in mind that when you're coming into an airport, this is basically the expectation of what the traffic is expected to do. When you're making your position reports, we're still going to follow the 4 whiskeys that we always talk about. If you don't know what the 4 whiskeys are, I'm going to link the video where we talked about how to communicate on the radio with air traffic control and when we're on the Unicom frequency. But the 4 whiskeys, again, are who we're calling, who we are, what our position is, and what our intentions are. The recommended reporting points that I always do are at 10 miles, 5 miles, when you're entering the pattern and where you're entering the pattern, and then once you enter the next leg of that traffic pattern. Again, when you're operating at a Class Bravo airport, you're going to start making your position reports at 20 miles, so you can do 20 miles, 10 miles, so on and so forth. And then again, once you're in that traffic pattern, anytime you make a turn to enter the next leg of that pattern, that is when you're going to make your position reports. And that'll do it for today's video. Thank you so much for hanging out, everybody. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to pop them in the comments section down below. I promise you, this new CTAF reporting system is not nearly as complicated as it may sound. The only really big change is the frequency that you're going to be doing it on. Thanks again for watching today's video, and until next time, everybody, this is Cross Hyperu, signing out.